It's pretty friendly. Like, usually when it's not in the evenings, it's just a social club basically. Social hub.
World of Tanks' historical theming, rooted in the technological advances in the mid-20th century, was immediately appealing to tank fanatics and anybody with a passing interest in warfare. It found considerable success in Russia and Europe, attracting a dedicated community which would fuel developer Wargaming's success. However, World of Tanks has changed over the years, and these changes left the community divided and estranged, turning away many players.
Back then, Wargaming had, you could say, better morals, in a sense.
I've enlisted the help of two good friends, Dai and Iceman, to help me identify exactly what happened which brought on this shift. World of Tanks appealed not only to dedicated gamers, but also to a casual audience of tank enthusiasts. It achieved this thanks to its free-to-play model, low system requirements, and tacky shoot-the-target web adverts. However, casual was a word unfitting for the game itself. Intense strategic combat was its specialty, and the substantial grind for new vehicles and upgrades was reminiscent of many MMOs. As you'd expect with a free-to-play game, there were in-game purchases, but in the early days, these were surprisingly unintrusive.
So how does premium currency, premium tanks, premium ammo and gold, how does all that work?
Oh, this is going to start rants, isn't it?
Yep.
Premium ammo only offered a slight situational benefit, so its use was uncommon. Premium tanks were often weaker than their counterparts, but could be used in separate premium matchmaking. Finally, premium accounts granted players additional currency and XP from matches. Following its release, the game would receive innumerable balance changes, tanks, and maps, which I will not be listing here for the sake of brevity. Tanks in the game were separated into tiers based on how modern they were and by their size.
A lot of patches had new tanks being introduced, and you could say that Wargaming was still at their experimental phase with the game.
Tanks which did not fit in a tier were moved, and owners of the moved tank kept the original but were also given its replacement for free. An ideal compromise. Let's talk Update 0.7, the update which brought replays. Players could now save their favourite matches after the matter. As this process was so simple and the replays took up very little memory, it became standard to save every game by default. This feature birthed a growing YouTube scene, which had an absolutely monumental impact on the game's popularity. Suddenly, the game's most exciting moments were popping up all over, drawing in new players. Improved mod support opened the floodgates for HUD, sound and skin modding. The most popular mod of the time was XVM, the Extended Visualization mod, which provided player stats, damage indicators, and gun range rings. The mod was so popular that Wargaming implemented many of its features into the base game. It also unfortunately created an elitist attitude among those who only wanted to play with the best players. This made XVM very controversial. 0.8 introduced a new rendering and lighting engine. To coincide with the fresh new look, tanks were given a new physics model, which allowed players to drown themselves and to jump off cliffs, which is not how that was meant to sound. This opened up many new and unintended flanking routes on maps, which meant, you guessed it, map rebalancing.
I think the implementation of physics was probably the biggest. Just still one of the biggest updates, the most impactful.
The new physics also made artillery suicide more common.
Artillery would just roll up to a wall and kill themselves. They just shoot the wall and they die from the splash damage.
Wait, but why?
Because they don't want to give the enemy the XP of killing them.
Oh my god, okay.
Artillery units in general were very controversial, as they could kill enemies at great range, away from any significant danger. They would receive multiple reworks over the years, but many in the community are still unhappy with their presence in the game. The year wrapped up with a new British tank tree and some new autoloaders. These vehicles, first introduced with the French tree, featured a clip of multiple shells which took a long time to reload, giving them incredible mind game potential.
But then it was also a lot of fun when you feigned retreat by firing off a few rounds, assuming that they didn't notice that you didn't fire off the last round, and then you fall back, and then they try to go around the corner, you pop their tracks off, and...
Or that you were reloaded, and you took in that they were, you see, they were trying to come around the corner, but instead of pulling back, you drive forwards to pretend that you have a full magazine, so they'd be scared and back off, but in reality you have like 20 seconds left.
Premium ammo also became attainable without spending actual money. Though it did not provide additional damage, it did offer better penetration, and its increased presence led to tanks receiving armor buffs. Oh, sorry about that, that is just my power creep alarm. Let me go turn that off. There we go. The game's accuracy system was overhauled, increasing accuracy across the board. This was divisive. Though the change did make sniper tanks more useful, it also made high accuracy tanks nearly redundant. Increasing the accuracy of every single vehicle also resulted in... Sorry, I thought I turned that off. A new German tank destroyer branch benefited from some of the more amusing tank nicknames in the community. Since many players had a strong affection for tanks, inside jokes became replacements for real vehicle names. From this update, players received the Waffle Tractor and the Toaster, which could aim its gun vertically. In December, the Japanese tank tree was added, and the map port was removed.
The thing back then was, you couldn't shoot through walls. So that meant that that wall, separating the train tracks from the little grassy bit in front of the houses, could be used as cover. But once they made it so you could shoot through the walls, they basically decided, actually this is kind of buggered, isn't it?
They didn't have the time, or they couldn't be bothered changing it, but it was a really good map before that, so I miss it.
Yeah. The last thing they did with Port is turn it into a racetrack.
Yeah, the Chaffee race.
Yes, and temporarily there was a mode that you could enter where you'd be just thrown into a M24 Chaffee.
The game's first few years were very successful for Wargaming. French, British, Chinese and Japanese tanks were introduced to the game. A new Xbox 360 version was released, and the game benefited from a large European player base and a massive Russian one. In fact, the Russian players broke the world record for most players on the same game server, over 190,000 people. Keeping an open ear to the community played a major part in maintaining a healthy relationship with players. But that bond was about to be tested. In 2012, War Thunder released and began taking up World of Tanks airspace. Wargaming released World of Warplanes a year later, and War Thunder introduced tanks to their game. Though its realistic gameplay was distinct from World of Tanks, comparisons were drawn between the two, especially regarding War Thunder's superior graphical fidelity. Wargaming, not to be outdone, introduced 10 new high-definition tanks in version 0.9, featuring new models and textures. The release of HD tanks was inconsistent, as the work was outsourced to other studios. Some of them even had to be remade due to inaccuracies in their models. In the end, War Thunder would prove successful, but it wouldn't pose a major risk to World of Tanks.
I don't think there was much of an effect of them, considering that the two games went very different paths.
Ironically, it would be Wargaming themselves who would hurt their game.
Has the player base changed in size in recent history? Like, let's say since patch 9.
You picked the perfect one.
This represented a turning point for the studio, as they started making some questionable business decisions. In their eagerness to release the visual overhaul, they rushed out the update wholly unoptimized.
It was patch 9, wasn't it, where the optimization just died? The game started running horribly, and there was like a mass exodus.
Wargaming also promised Havoc physics implementation, which would only be partially achieved 4 years later. However, poor optimization wasn't the only thing turning people away.
The reason things started going downhill because they just started rebalancing every tank that was already in the game.
It would take Wargaming several years to complete the roster of HD tanks, and in this time, controversial vehicles such as the Waffenträger Aufs E100 and the T110E5 flew under the radar. Tanks brought to HD also had weak spots removed. This meant that the only effective way to take down very heavy tanks was with premium ammo. These changes were attributed to one man in particular, Murazor, a Russian World of Tanks YouTuber who Wargaming brought on as lead balance designer. I was going to comment on the average YouTuber's insight into game development, but then I realised how ironic that would be. Murazor was also credited with introducing some of the game's most overpowered tanks, which continued until his demotion.
I'm not sure if this is going to change anything or if it's a scapegoat.
On a somewhat lighter note, Wargaming's temporary event proved successful. For example, to celebrate the World Cup, a tank football mode was added which would return every 2 years. They also dabbled in low-gravity battles on the moon, PvE matches, and pixelated artillery. Temporary events allowed Wargaming to test potential new features like multi-turret tanks and armoured cars in a closed environment. On the permanent mode front, things weren't looking so hot. The recently added historical battles fell flat because, surprise, historically accurate battles are generally unbalanced. Fortunately, they found more success with strongholds, which clans could own, customize, and raid. This is in part due to the popularity of clans in general. The most popular clan activity was Clan Wars, a highly strategic fight over territory.
In the evenings you have clan wars. All the good clans would be doing the clan wars battles. There was actually quite a good, nice community around it because all the big clans would like talk to each other and plan out when they would have a battle.
The leaders dictated overall strategy, with members practicing, planning, and battling for victory. Rewards were determined based on individual participation and the total owned territory.
I do remember in Reddit we had a clan treasurer, because that was actually a position you could give to someone in a clan. And then he'd take a look at participation and split the gold based on how you participated. So it was actually a decent way of getting gold.
When not engaged in wars, clan members would often play platoon battles, which were a much more casual affair.
I remember that Danish guy kept posting bee porn or something. I have like ingrained in my memory. He posted some video where some woman clad in bee clothes got a up her and
Oh, not this video. Oh, I remember this.
I remember that.
I've been scarred.
The second you acted like a dick, you had the chance of being kicked out, but acting weird and showing bee porn was perfectly fine.
The game's graphical fidelity was upped once again, with new HD textures for maps, though the widespread optimization issues had not yet been resolved. Not long after, the game's client would be split into standard and high-definition versions, for the benefit of low-end systems. The new personal missions offered players a way to earn special reward tanks. There were special objectives for every vehicle type, and some encouraged you to play in platoons with friends. The Honor system provided additional objectives which rewarded players with 3 days of premium, garage slots, or currency.
This, I would say, was a great system. It had horrific balancing issues at times.
there was so much money. Oh yes, I remember all the money made from that.
It was this period that my two unwitting interviewees credited as the golden age of World of Tanks.
I loved the game around 2014, 2015. I won every day when I came home. I just went right to the computer just to play World of Tanks.
But my entire day was basically, alright, I'm looking forward. When I get home, Dai's gonna already be home because he finishes an hour ahead of us. He'll be waiting there. I'll go on. We'll play tanks for an unreasonable amount of time.
Though Patch 9 would later prove to be the turning point for many, the overall World of Tanks experience at the time remained addictive and entertaining. It was ported to the Xbox One, the new mobile version also saw great success, with the Android version receiving 1.1 million downloads within 2 months, and despite controversy, the PC version was still incredibly popular. However, all good things must come to an end, and oh boy, things were about to get risque. In March 2015, Silent Stalker, creator of prominent World of Tanks news site For The Record, hung up his hat, which he in part accredited to the game's recent emphasis on paid content over other features. Several months later, patch 9.10 brought a new event, 20 HD vehicle reworks, and the new Japanese heavy tank branch.
It was a cold 2015 autumn, and Wargaming decided to release the fucking Japanese heavy tank branch.
This branch was notorious.
This was the first tree where people were like, the fuck are you doing?
The Tier 5 had a way too big gun and it could one-shot Tier 4s.
The Tier 6 had retarded armor. It was dumb, and it had no weak spots. The Tier 7 also had really strong armor. Tier 8, same. And then you get to the Tier 9. Before they nerfed it, it was basically impenetrable for any Tier 8 from the front expansion. It had no tight weak spots and no hard weak spots. The only place you could was from the side. Even if you tried picking armor, would bounce from time to time.
And then there's the one after it, which is just the same but more armor.
In October, World of Tanks' competitor Armored Warfare released. Sadly, despite significant hype for the title, it was marred by poor management.
Armored Warfare was never going to succeed. It failed from the beginning.
Basically, Armored Warfare was fucked over by its developers horribly.
It wasn't the developers, it was the publishers. The developers
Yes, the
didn't have any
publishers.
say in the game.
Obsidian Entertainment were told to make the game more similar to World of Tanks, and this squandered any potential that the game had. Once again, Wargaming were left in their own corner of the market, mostly undisturbed. Around this time, the PlayStation 4 version was released, the sound system was updated to allow more realistic positioning, and the physics were overhauled again. Tanks were now able to roll, slide, and drift, but these physics changes allowed fast tanks to boost into unintended locations. This meant that many maps had to be updated to solve these issues. Until this point, any overpowered tanks were usually standard ones. In fact, premium tanks were normally less powerful than their standard equivalents, but rewarded additional currency and XP. Most premium tanks also featured premium matchmaking, which was more forgiving as it did not match up against the top tier. However, this trend would shift over the years, as a significant number of premium tanks would flood the marketplace, and premium tanks became more powerful. Oh wow, I must have fixed the alarm.
Every new premium tank they're adding does not have premium matchmaking.
They're planning on facing out all the premium matchmaking tanks as well.
Yeah.
To cut Wargaming some slack, they reached a no-win scenario in regards to premium tanks and matchmaking. Their original business plan involved continually producing new premium tanks, but doing this meant that premium tanks massively outnumbered the standard ones, shifting the focus towards premium matchmaking and away from standard matches. However, instead of creating more standard tanks, they decided to make premiums more powerful and integrate them into standard play, creating a pay-to-win scenario. To add fuel to the fire, in early 2017 the contacts list in North American servers broke, making it almost impossible for Americans to play with their friends for an extended duration, and this lasted for a long time. It didn't help that the game was less popular in this region, despite Wargaming's eagerness to tap into the market. In contrast to other regions, American players often received preferential treatment in the form of free content and giveaways, which did not go unnoticed elsewhere. And if you want bitter, well, it's time to break out the limes. The Defender, which released in February of 2017, faced one of the poorest receptions to a tank ever. This is because its unusual armor sloping gave it immense effective thickness, making it very overpowered.
Since they started making premium tanks be as strong, if not stronger, than normal tanks, that's when the armor started going out of control.
When it comes to game balancing, Wargaming used and still do use a very ham-fisted strategy. They rarely ever nerf tanks, and especially not premium ones, out of fear that customers would feel betrayed. This meant that when an overpowered tank appeared, every other tank in the game would receive a buff to offset this imbalance. I've got to say, I'm glad I turned the power creep alarm off, otherwise it would have gone deaf by now. To give some examples, the Type 59 was removed from the premium shop, and only given out as rewards. Eventually, power creep caught up with it, making it useless. The E25 was another broken tank that was removed from the shop, but in this case, Wargaming opted to sell it as part of absurdly expensive event packages. So you can imagine that when the particularly overpowered Defender released, it did not go down well. And that brings us to the Chrysler K. Popular World of Tanks YouTuber Sir Fosh released a video in which he heavily criticised the Chrysler K's lack of weak spots in a very notable fashion.
Because Wargaming, their terrible way of making these premium tanks lately. and this premium tank in particular.
He also lambasted the company's heavy-handed implementation of new premium tanks, sacrificing the game's balance in an effort to generate more profit. This was particularly prickly because Sir Foch was a member of the game's community contributor program. Wargaming removed him from this program, told him to take the video down, and threatened to file DMCA claims on his World of Tanks content unless he complied. And then the floodgates opened. Prominent World of Tanks channels such as the Mighty Jingles left the program. Screenshots of his Discord discussion with Wargaming picked up steam on Reddit, and gaming news sites published the story. Average player counts took a significant hit, as prominent industry names such as Jim Sterling voiced their disapproval of Wargaming. The company issued a public apology for their actions, but the damage had already been done. In the wider gaming space, the name Wargaming had been soured. Though player numbers were still at healthy levels, this controversy only helped to further the slow decline across most regions. Fans became increasingly tired of the direction the game was taking, and of Wargaming's lack of response to feedback. This was again highlighted with the new matchmaking system. It tried to make matches of 3, 5, 7. 3 top tier tanks, 5 1 tier below, and 7 2 tiers below. It's worth noting that of the 10 tiers, tiers 8 and 10 were most popular. See the problem yet?
So how's the new matchmaking?
Horrible, because tier 8s basically always meet tier 10 now.
As tier 10s were significantly more powerful, this made tier 8 players very frustrated. Wargaming did very little to rectify this, instead digging in their heels and claiming that this was caused by weaker tier 8 premiums taking up tier 9 players, creating an imbalance in tier distribution. Despite multiple updates to the matchmaking, Wargaming failed to fix the system's fundamental problems, further disappointing an already disillusioned player base. Version 1.0 released just this year, in March 2018. Finally, the transition to HD tanks was complete, and the game received a major visual upgrade with a new graphics engine. It took a long time, but the widespread optimization issues were finally amended with this update. The promise of Havoc engine physics would also be somewhat fulfilled here, with improved destruction to walls and vehicles. However, this was far from the ambitious update that was promised 4 years prior. Many maps were given reworks, higher quality assets and patches. Version 1 also made it possible to paint your tanks.
Ooh, that is interesting, because most games tend to fall into the TF2 thing of what's an art style?
I imagine there would have been quite a... Well, actually, the second that happened, there was already people saying, I don't want to see pink and blue mouse tanks driving around my maps.
This led Wargaming to provide a toggle option, but they still intend to expand painting options in the future. Later, Italian tanks were introduced, along with a new temporary frontline mode. Though similar to the immense scale of grand battles, its attack-defense structure made it very popular, and ever since its recent removal, many have clamoured for its return. Premium ammo was changed to only be purchasable with credits, as opposed to both credits and gold. You could argue that this was in response to pay-to-win complaints, but in reality, purchasing premium ammo with real money was always a rare situation. That brings us to today. Nearly 8 years later, World of Tanks hosts over 400 vehicles across 34 maps, and a mixture of permanent and event modes. It started with just American, German and Soviet vehicles, but expanded to offer British, Chinese, French, Swedish, Czech and Japanese tanks. Over the years, it became a home for a deeply committed, enthusiast community, but that same community would prove to be Wargaming's greatest critics. The history of Wargaming and World of Tanks is surrounded in controversy. And though Wargaming were initially very receptive to fan feedback, power creep and an emphasis on premium features has taken hold. Though player counts have waned recently, and Wargaming's decisions have left many divided, the game still holds a sizable portion of its original audience, once again demonstrating the sheer dedication of many World of Tanks players. Despite Wargaming testing their commitment over and over again, the community continues to thrive.